Hello and welcome to a video I was hoping I wouldn't have to make for a while, but here we are. How to change a water pump on your 2015 Dodge Dart. I'll also throw up a list of other vehicles that use this water pump. It's going to be roughly the same process. It should be in roughly the same place. Just how you get to it as far as, getting to it through the wheel well and things might be a little bit different. But it's going to be the same process either way, so let's jump into it. I came outside one morning and found a big puddle of coolant underneath my car. I used a white paper towel to see what color it was, and sure enough, it was pink, which is the color of the OEM coolant. So I lifted up the car, I took off the wheel and the fender well liner just so I could see the inside of the engine bay from the side, and I traced the path of the drips, and I was able to see that it was leaking directly from the water pump, so that's what I knew I had to replace. Next step is to get the engine bay ready to work on, so I pulled off the top cover and removed the intake. Remember to disconnect any electrical connectors or extra hoses you might have. Next step is the research phase. I looked up the factory service manual. I was able to find a PDF online, and I looked up the serpentine belt diagram, so I knew which pulley was the one to loosen the belt and get it off. So I was able to take the belt off and get to the water pump without the belt in the way. I also looked up the removal and installation procedure for the water pump to see if there was any weird instructions that the manufacturer wants done, and to look up the critical torque specs. And then the next step was trying to find a replacement water pump. Thankfully, I didn't have to go to a dealership, but you can if you want to. I was able to find one at my local auto parts store. It had a lifetime warranty for $75, so that's the one I got. Make sure you get coolant when you go to get your water pump. I forgot, and by the time it was ready to refill the system, the store was closed, so I had to wait until the next day. We are going to have to drain and refill the system while we do this replacement, so make sure you get 2 gallons of coolant when you go to get your water pump. Once you have your parts and you're ready to get working, we need to drain the system of coolant. I have another video on my channel on how to do this, how to drain it and refill it using the factory methods. I'll put a link down in the description below. To quickly summarize, we want to put a piece of vinyl tubing over the drain on the bottom of the radiator, then put the other end of that tube into the drain pan. This way we don't have to take the whole under tray of the car off because there's too many connectors. It's a pain to deal with, and you don't really need to take it off, so this way is a lot faster, a lot easier. I use a pair of pliers to open the plastic drain just because it's really hard to do by hand. Make sure you loosen it so it goes about 90 to 180 degrees to loosen, and then it'll stop. At that point, make sure you actually pull it out to get to the next step, and then you can turn it counterclockwise to loosen it some more, and then coolant will start flowing. If you just turn it, no coolant's going to come out and you're going to think you're doing something wrong. Make sure the little drain piece is actually coming out while you're twisting it. The next step is to remove the serpentine belt, so refer to the belt routing diagram so you know which pulley is the tensioner pulley. The space was too small to use a socket wrench, so I just used regular crescent wrenches for everything. The tensioner is the pulley that's right behind the alternator, so put the wrench on there. I used my left hand to hold back the tension that's in the tensioner, and then I used my right hand to get the belt to slip off the end of the alternator. From there, you can just get the belt out in the small space between the engine and the frame rail. I didn't bother taking the engine mount off. You can do this whole job with the engine mount in place. It's just going to be a little tighter, but it's going to be tight anyway, so just save yourself the hassle and don't take off the engine mounts. So if you already took the belt off and you still need to loosen the pulley bolts, what you can do is just take your old serpentine belt, wrap it just around that pulley, and then hold it with your other hand. Don't have to put it all the way back on. You can just put it here, kind of use this groove to like brace and get tension against it, and then you should be able to loosen the pulley bolts down there without having to put it all back on and route it and mess with the tensioner again, just to undo it when you actually do replace the belt. So this is just an easy way to get some good tension, because trying to hold it with your hand isn't going to work. But if you wrap the belt around it, you get way more surface area, way more friction, and you can actually break those bolts loose on the pulley. These are 10mm bolts, so I will get these out and continue the process. To reach all the bolts, you're going to have to reach down from the top of the engine bay, but also reach up from inside the wheel well to get to the bolts at the bottom. The pulley was seized onto the water pump, so after I got the 3 10mm bolts out, I did use a pry bar between the edge of the pulley and the timing cover and just gently worked my way around, slowly rotating the pulley just so I could pry evenly on all sides so I didn't bend it, but it did eventually come out. After the pulley is off, you're going to want to take the bolts for the pump itself out. I put a funnel underneath because as soon as I started loosening the bolts, it started leaking. Even though we drained the cooling system, it's still going to have enough to make a big mess. So just get the funnel now, get the drain pan, and get a bunch of paper towel to soak everything up because it's just going to spill everywhere. There's 5 bolts. There's 3 or 4 you can access from the top, and the other 1 or 2 you have to get from the bottom. I had to use a socket for one of them just because the crescent wrench was really hard to get into the really tight spaces. So just take your time, be patient. It's going to be a pain to try and get all the bolts off just because of being so close to the frame rail. When I removed the water pump, the dowel pins were still left in the engine block. They were stuck in there pretty tight, so I couldn't just pull them out with a pair of pliers. I ended up taking one of the water pump bolts, putting it inside the dowel pin, but not screwing it into the threads, just putting it like in the hole, and then using a flathead screwdriver and a hammer to gently tap on the bolt to try and work the dowel pin from side to side, up and down, just to try and loosen it so I was able to come out using needle nose pliers. And with the pump out, I just wiped down the engine block, cleaned inside, made sure there was no gasket material left on the sealing surface. I cleaned the new water pump because it had a lot of fuzz from the cardboard box that was on it, and we don't want to get that into our cooling system. I took the gasket. I used a little bit of gasket maker. This isn't really required, but I did it just to make sure the gasket and the water pump would stick together when I was putting it into the engine bay, just because it'd be really frustrating to have the gasket fall out at the last minute, and then you have to try and pick it up and put it back on the pump and get the pump back into the engine before the gasket falls out. It's just a pain, so I used some gasket maker and just put it evenly around the edges. And then make sure you bring a bolt with you, because otherwise you will go to hold it against the engine and you'll have no bolt, and it's just going to fall out if you take your hand away. So make sure you bring a bolt with you, so when you line up the dowel pins and you have the pump back in the engine, you can tighten that one bolt, and that way it's not going to fall out. After you have the one bolt back in the engine bay, you can put in the other 4 bolts. You're going to have to get creative in putting the other bolts back in just because of how tight the space is. And then we are going to tighten them. So the manual says to use a crisscross pattern, kind of like when you're mounting your wheels, just to make sure it's evenly torqued. There is no space to use a torque wrench, so just try and remember how much force you used when you were loosening the bolts. When you were removing the old water pump, use almost as much force, just because the old bolts may have seized and there would have been a little extra force to break them loose. So just use your best judgment. Don't over tighten it because you don't want to strip any of the threads out. This is especially important on the water pump pulley because those bolts are so small, it's very easy to snap them off, and then now you have to try and extract the bolts from the engine bay and there's no space to work. So just be gentle, and again, try and remember how much force you used when you took off the old one. Now that the water pump and the pulley are back on the engine, it's time to put the serpentine belt back on. If you want to replace your serpentine belt with a brand new one, now would be the perfect time. Just make sure you buy it when you go to get the water pump and the coolant. To put the serpentine belt back on, I kind of put it around 1 or 2 pulleys, looking at the old belt routing diagram, and then moved it to another few pulleys and just slowly worked it around, adding 1 more pulley to the path until the only pulley I had left was the alternator pulley. So then you can put your wrench back on the tensioner. You can use your left hand to pull the tensioner back. That should give you enough slack in the belt to get it over the alternator pulley, and then you can slowly release the tension from the tensioner so that way you don't pinch your fingers or anything. And then check the belt to make sure that it's straight and all the grooves are where they should be. It's not off on one side or anything like that. And then you can put the intake back together. You can tighten the water pump pulley bolts now that the belt is back on, and it's going to keep that pulley from turning. Just make sure you remember to connect all the hoses and all the electrical connectors you may have disconnected from the intake. The final step is to fill your cooling system and bleed any air bubbles. I'll link my old video down below for how to do that using the factory method. So to quickly summarize, again, we're using the airlift pump to pull a vacuum on the system. So you connect an air compressor, you run it at least 95 psi. The Venturi draws a vacuum on the system. Once it gets above 26 on the little vacuum gauge, you close it so it's holding the system at a vacuum. You can disconnect the air compressor if you want, just so that hissing stops for a little while and it can rebuild pressure in the compressor. While you check and make sure that the vacuum isn't leaking down and you have leaks in your system, give it a few minutes to wait and then go fill up a bucket with your fresh, clean coolant. Make sure the bucket is clean so you're not pulling dirt into your cooling system. If the vacuum is holding, you can go ahead and put the fill hose into the bucket, pre-fill it with coolant so you're not sucking in a bunch of air. Connect it to the ball valve and then open everything, and it should just pull the coolant directly from the bucket into the system and fill it without air pockets, but we're still going to bleed it afterwards just in case. So disconnect everything after it's done pulling all the coolant in, reattach the radiator cap, and then we're going to get ready to start the engine. So start the engine, walk around, check for leaks, make sure that things aren't leaking from the pump that you just installed. And then we're going to go inside, and we need to have the engine RPM between 2,500 and 3,000 per the manual. Make sure the heat is on full blast, the hottest temperature, and the blower motor is set all the way to hot. This will make sure that the coolant is circulating through the heater circuit and there's not any air bubbles in there. It was summertime when I did this, so I had to roll down all the windows because otherwise I would have died of heat from being inside my car on a summer day with the heat on full blast. So just be smart about that. Continue revving the engine and watch the temperature gauge. It should get to about the middle point. Right around there is when the thermostat opens, and it should be circulating coolant through the radiator. This helps to make sure, again, that the circuit is fully open. There's no air pockets anywhere that are going to be plaguing us later on down the road. So once you get to that point, you can turn off the engine and get out and check for leaks one final time, and then go ahead and put everything back together, and you should be good to go. You can put the fender well back on, you can put the wheel back on, and you can take it for a test drive. I recommend over the next few days, just make sure you're watching closely on the ground for any leaks. Make sure you're checking the radiator coolant reservoir tank, because as time goes on and it does bleed a few of those really small air pockets, it will use up a little more coolant, so make sure you're topping it off if it does get a little bit low. And also if it just keeps getting low and getting low after a week, there's probably another leak somewhere, so it's good to just check. But other than that, you should be done. You've replaced your water pump, maybe you've replaced your serpentine belt if you wanted to, you've cleaned your air filter if you want, and then you've refilled with fresh coolant. So you should be good to go for hopefully a good long time. So thanks for watching. If you want to see more car videos or motorcycle videos or just weird garage projects, please like and subscribe. I've been very busy, but I have multiple videos in the works. They're in progress. I just haven't had time to edit them and upload them, but new videos are coming soon. So please subscribe and stick around for more. And again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.